Just going to chug the rest of this coffee real quick, and then we'll go. Okay, this is Chapter 16 of Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp by Christopher Browning, narrated to you live by Carter Banks. Chapter 16, Food, Property, and the Underground Economy. Even when German employers valued Jewish labor and wanted it to be productive, and furthermore understood that starving Jews were less productive than adequately nourished ones, they invariably encountered a systemic problem within the Nazi Empire. The ravages and demands of war had created a general food shortage that reached crisis proportions by 1942. Among all the populations of Nazi-occupied Europe whose claims on an inadequate food supply were being weighed and prioritized, Jews invariably were placed last in line. Thus, even though the Jewish factory slave labor camps in the Radom district were not liquidated, the prisoners remained undernourished. As one Strachowitz survivor noted, the Jews there did not die from how little the Germans fed them, but they could not live from it either. A Jewish strategy of survival through labor, therefore, was burdened with terrible ironies. It depended not only on Jews buying their own enslavement through the purchase of work permits and providing labor indispensable to the war effort, thereby prolonging German rule, but also, to no small extent, on supplementing the inadequate German food supply through their own ingenuity and efforts. In the early months of camp life, typhus and the Althoff terror understandably eclipsed concerns about food. At that time, the prisoners received only 2 meals per day: imitation coffee and a piece of bread in the morning, and watery soup and a piece of bread in the evening. When the German factory management ended the Althoff policy of killing the sick, they also improved the food supply. A third meal of soup and bread was added at mid-shift on the factory premises. In his post-war defense, Kurt Otto Baumgarten took full credit for this improvement, claiming that he arranged for the direct delivery of supplies to the camp council rather than through the factory, where the Jewish allotment had been regularly pilfered, and for the construction of a bakery in Mazhauka to prepare the bread ration on the spot. As virtually all accounts agreed that living conditions improved at this point, and an improvement in food supply was consistent with Baumgarten's interests at the time, this is a rare case where self-serving post-war German testimony seems credible. The camp soup, which along with bread was the mainstay of the prisoners' diet, was a watery brew flavored with potato peels, turnips, cabbage, or rutabaga. A little marmalade was occasionally added for the morning bread, or a little horse meat to the evening soup. The watery soup was so foul in taste and smelled that 2 prisoners testified that despite the hunger, they went through the entire 21 months in the Strachowitz camps unable to eat it. The factory soup, according to one witness, was marginally better, made with vegetables and fish. Everyone sought to supplement these meager rations. Some prisoners mentioned that they survived by virtue of charity or connections. A number of survivors offered testimony that at least some Poles gave away food at the factory out of pity or sympathy. More noted that they had relatives or friends working in the camp kitchen who provided them with extra rations. For example, Elahu Koslowski described how he sometimes worked a second shift, substituting for Moniak Rubenstein. In exchange, the latter would exploit his relationship with his uncle, John Kale Rubenstein, who was in charge of the camp kitchen, to procure meat and potatoes. If you had influence, you could survive, Koslowski concluded. For the vast majority of prisoners, however, the most common way of supplementing the food supply was simply through purchase. Sometimes this was done directly in camp. According to Mendel Kack, scarce items such as meat and sugar, which had been distributed equally to all prisoners when available in Wallenau, were hoarded and sold to those with means by the camp council in Majauka. The kitchen was controlled by relatives of the camp council, so there were no witnesses to their stealing. Kack charged. Another newcomer from Wallenau was equally indignant and accusatory at finding even prepared food for sale in the camp. So how did they get it? Well, they stole from the kitchen, they cooked, and they sold to people. So if you had enough money, you could buy. They had like 2 restaurants in the camp. Our Jews could do it. It was really bad. The main market for food, however, was not between privileged and wealthy Jews inside the camp, but between Jews and Poles outside the camp. The initial resources for this exchange were twofold. The valuables that at least some of the prisoners had brought into camp at considerable risk in defiance of the German demand to surrender them, and the clothing they were wearing or carried in their bundles. One survivor had worn a new top coat to the marketplace and into camp, despite the warm weather. He subsequently bartered it for bread. A prisoner transferred to Plazau sold the good pair of boots he was wearing to buy food. A refugee from Plock had refused to turn in her wedding ring, and she had an extra dress. Both were bartered for bread. Those who had more resources to begin with and had prepared ahead of time were somewhat better off. Goldie Sacher's father had carefully hidden valuables in the family's shoe heels and clothing that they wore into camp. They did not go hungry. Chana Glatt had likewise kept her nerve and not surrendered the diamonds and gold she had carried to camp. Little by little, these were traded for bread. Exchanges between Jews and Poles usually took place at the factories. Ruth Rabinowitz had the task of carrying soup kettles from the factory kitchen to the mess hall. She would carry money with her and buy extra bread directly from the kitchen personnel. If there was extra soup, the factory kitchen also sold it at 1 zloty per bowl. Groups of workers would also band together to buy loaves of bread that Polish workers brought to the factory. Eli Chaim Oberman met each day with the same Polish worker who brought him a bottle of goat's milk, and he drank on the spot. For many, buying potatoes at the factories was particularly convenient because they could be cooked in no time by placing them near one of the furnaces. Exchanges took place elsewhere as well. Those who had Polish friends in town could buy from them during the march to or from work. As the column went around a corner and those behind the front guard were briefly out of sight of the rear guard, quick exchanges could be made between the marching prisoners and those standing on the side of the road. A person with means, Yashiel Sacher, arranged for himself to work outside the factory, collecting scrap iron for the smelter. He had sought this position for himself because this particular situation better enabled him to remain in contact with Poles, from whom he bought food and other items. As the camp regime became more relaxed, Poles even came to the fence to sell. They would take orders for delivery and set a time for the subsequent meeting and exchange. The valuables and clothing that individual Jews brought into camp initially, even for those most prepared and well-stocked, were clearly exhaustible resources that did not suffice to continue buying supplementary food over a period of 21 months. For the continued importation of food, an underground camp economy had to be created and financed. for this new source of income had to be found or generated. One major source of new funds was the property many of the interned Jews had left with Polish friends before the liquidation of the ghetto. Accessing such property was the key, and it was especially difficult for those not from Wierzbnik. One refugee of Sildwyk had given her suitcase full of possessions she had brought with her to a very nice Polish guy. He subsequently brought bread and other items to her. Another family from Sildwyk had buried their gold and silver. They revealed the location to someone they trusted, who subsequently brought bread to them every so often. The wealthy Sacher family from Bolzentine had carefully buried many valuables whose locations were noted on a closely guarded treasure map. When funds were needed, they too placed their trust in a Pole and gave him the map with an agreement to split the proceeds. The Pole, a young communist who was subsequently caught and executed for his underground activities, delivered the sack of gold and silver coins as agreed. Many native Wierzbnikers depended on the goodwill of friends, neighbors, and business associates with whom they had left property to deliver food or money periodically to the factory. Most Poles with whom property had been left proved to be decent and honorable in this regard. In contrast to post-war attempts to recover property, there were surprisingly few complaints about Poles who were given property by Jewish friends and then refused to help while the Jews remained as workers in Strachowicz. At certain times, it was much more practical and tempting for native Wierzbnikers to risk leaving camp in order to access their nearby valuables personally. For two groups, this involved little danger. At the unguarded and unfenced Tartak, people simply slipped out at night, went to their nearby homes, and gradually brought things back. To the camps. In the camp elite in Strelnica and Mazowka could get passes to leave and visit town to conduct business. For most prisoners, however, leaving camp and making contact with Poles to recover property or conduct business was both less frequent and more dangerous. These ventures outside of camp were thus remembered with particular vividness by those who undertook them. 14-year-old Chaim Wojchendler made two such journeys. On the first occasion, he sneaked out of camp to home of the woman with whom his younger brother was to have been hidden, and who therefore had been given many of the family's possessions. She denied she had anything belonging to the Wojchendlers, but since Chaim had helped deliver the items in question, he knew where they were located. He simply grabbed a bolt of cloth and ran back to the point where he could join a column of workers returning to camp. On a second occasion, he went to the secretary of his father's lawyer, who gave him 200 zloty and 3 shirts. Caught by a Ukrainian guard trying to sneak back into camp, he was beaten and then let go. Isek Guterman bribed a Ukrainian guard to leave camp, visited a woman with whom the family had left possessions, and returned with a pillow, blanket, bread, sugar, flour, and beets. Before he was caught and beaten, he threw his booty over the fence to his waiting brother. Nasha Baum slipped away from a column of workers marching to the factory, went to the man with whom her father had left his inventory of shoes from the family business, and presented him with a list of needs before rejoining her group of workers. On the march back to camp, she repeated the procedure, picking up the requested items. However, when she visited a Polish woman with whom the family had left the other possessions, the latter threatened to call the police. Nasha grabbed one item she recognized and fled. Rosha Kagut persuaded a lieutenant a lenient Ukrainian guard to let her leave camp on the promise that she would return quickly. She went to former neighbors with whom her family had left furs and jewelry. They were terribly frightened by her presence, gave her a hot meal, wrapped up some things, and told her to leave quickly. Her father then traded her retrieved items at the factory. Desperate for food, Josef Kaufman urged his teenage daughter to risk visiting the family with whom he had left property. She slipped out when a decent guard looked away and picked up bags of rice and farina from the family. Upon her return, she discovered the decent guard had been replaced, and she had to slip into camp under the wire. Abramek Naiman's mother had left 2 fur coats with one family. She slipped out, and they sheltered her for 2 nights while she arranged for the sale of the furs. Another family with whom they had left possessions, however, refused to give anything back. When his father fell ill, Abramek sneaked out of the camp and begged an apothecary for medicine. Though he had no money, the apothecary gave him some medicine. When her sister fell ill, Sala Glatt waited for the right guard to be on duty and then walked out of camp. She procured aspirin and other medicine from family friends, but she had to sneak back into camp upon return when she discovered the guard had changed. As in virtually every camp with the Nazi Empire, the most enterprising prisoners sought to organize to create some kind of private business or source of income to enhance their chances for survival. This was particularly urgent for prisoners from the outside who did not have the same opportunity as native Weerspannickers had to tap into reserves of hidden property. Salek Benedict from Slidwick collected pieces of old clothing, which he took to his friend, a skilled hat maker. Salek then sold the hats to Poles at work for potatoes, and in turn sold the potatoes to other prisoners. Regina Rosenblatt from Plock made brooms, and her brother-in-law made caps from blankets. On the days when good Ukrainian guards were on duty, these items were smuggled out of camp for sale. Chaim Klajman had been assigned to a job in the warehouse and made the most of his opportunity. First, he stole materials that he sold to shoemakers in camp. Then he arranged to be paid by someone on the outside to mark barrels in which he would place vodka from the warehouse supply for the Poles' vodka ration. So I was living pretty well, he concluded. In addition to individual and small group entrepreneurship in Mazhauka, more extensive production for the underground camp economy was also organized. The skilled craftsmen of the Konsum produced not only high-quality customized products for the Germans on demand, but also an array of consumer goods for sale to Poles on the black market. To be effective, this operation needed not only craftsmen, but large numbers of scroungers to keep the craftsmen supplied with raw materials and smugglers to transport and sell the finished product. Eli Chaim Oberman from Kielce said he had to do something to survive. Knowing where leather belts from obsolete machinery had been stored in the warehouse, he cut off pieces and sold them to the camp shoemakers whenever he had the chance. In the other direction, he smuggled repaired shoes and clothing from the camp to the factory to sell to Poles. Jakob Binstock from Sledwick smuggled products from the tailors and shoemakers to sell to Poles in the factory, then smuggled food, bought from Poles, back into the camp. Halina Furstenberg from Plock bought blouses that were sewn by girls in the camp and took them to the kitchen in the factory. There she exchanged the blouses for bread, which she took back to the girls who were sewing. Jacob Schaptowitz from Slodwick sold caps made by camp tailors to Poles in the factory and then bought bread and potatoes, which he resold in the camp for a profit. It can be no mere coincidence that most of these those smuggling the goods produced by the camp craftsmen were not native Weersbennickers, but rather outsiders who had to undertake such activities because they had no other economic resources on which to fall back. Given wartime shortages, there was no lack of demand from the Polish side for goods produced in the camp. But an adequate supply of raw materials for consume production for the black market was clearly a problem that threatened the viability of the whole project. Here, the camp council exercised its power on behalf of sustaining production for the black market, from which it clearly profited, rather than on behalf of internal distribution to alleviate the distress of ill-clad and ill-shod camp inmates. In the most notorious example, some 2,000 pairs of shoes arrived at Mazowka from Majdanek. Most prisoners were desperate for new footwear to replace the worn-out shoes with which they had come to camp, but only about 100 pairs were distributed to those in favor. The rest were cut up and used to make shoe tops for wooden clogs and sold to Poles on the black market. The critical Mendel Kak was convinced that the camp council gave a cut to the craftsmen but kept most of the profits for itself. The confiscated possessions of newcomers to the camp presumably served the same purpose, and when the clothing of Abramek Nyman's parents was shipped back from Firlij, he did not receive it as his property or inheritance. Rather, it was sold on the black market. The underground economy of Mazowka was crucial in supplementing the inadequate food supply and financing the systemic bribing of German officials such as Baumgarten. In these ways, all prisoners in the camp benefited to some degree, even if they did not benefit equally. But the extent and nature of the underground economy also intensified the pervasive inequality within the prisoner community. Camp society was already divided between privileged and ordinary prisoners. Sharp differences in economic standing created a second division. Native Weersbennickers with access to valuables that had been hidden with Poles had access to resources that outsiders and newcomers, with a few exceptions like the Sachers from Bodzentine, who had both hidden wealth and ties to Einesman, did not have. As one survivor noted, the non-Weersbennickers were in effect double strangers, in that they were both part of a Jewish minority amid a Polish majority, and outsiders and newcomers amid the native Weersbennick Jews. Lacking both outside resources and outside contacts, they faced a far greater challenge in coping with hardship and in insinuating themselves into the camp's underground economy. Economic disadvantage was, of course, compounded by a sense of exclusion from, and indeed exploitation by, the privileged Jews of the camp elite, in a system in which the dispensing of favors from above invariably required the payment of bribes from below. As Leo Bach from Krakow and Plazau put it, one of the unpleasant experiences for me in that camp was the strong feeling of sectionalism among the inmates. The great majority of the people there were locals. We, from Krakow, were treated as intruders, unwanted guests. The Jews from Lodz and Pluck at least had some time to integrate into the community, and those from the places such as Bodzentine and Slidowiec, who had relatives or contacts with the Weersbennick community, seemed also to cope relatively well. But the later newcomers from Kielce, Wallonau, Radom, Tomaszow, Mazowki, and Plazau were brought directly into Mazowka from other camps, were especially vulnerable and often bitter and resentful at their fall to the bottom of their new camp's social hierarchy. That concludes Chapter 16 of Christopher Browning's Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp.